Mr. Cross, the scans show rapid progression. We must operate immediately.
How could this happen so fast?
These enzyme levels are inconsistent with the timeline. We need to talk, privately.
No empire on Earth could buy back a heartbeat, and Damian Cross was about to learn that the hard way, 1 ounce at a time, as his infant son quietly starved inside a glass box that cost more than most people's houses. Lightning split the sky over Manhattan as a black convoy of SUVs pulled up outside St. Prof. Augustine's Memorial on the Upper East Side. Inside, on the 9th floor, behind a wall of armed men in tailored suits, a premature baby boy lay in an incubator, tubes running into his small body, his weight dropping a little more every single day, despite the best doctors money could summon. Nobody could explain why. A nurse named Naomi Reyes was about to find out, and what she found would put her own life directly in the path of the most dangerous man in the city. 3 weeks earlier, the storm had been just as violent the night Sophia Cross went into early labor. Damian had been 36 floors above the city in his penthouse office when the call came that his pregnant wife had collapsed at home, gasping for air, her lips turning faintly blue from a gas leak nobody could later explain. Paramedics delivered the baby by emergency cesarean in the back of the ambulance, fighting to save a child who weighed barely 4 pounds. Sophia never woke up. The official report blamed a faulty furnace. Damian Cross did not believe in faulty furnaces, not in his own house, not where his enemies knew exactly where he slept. Since that night, the 9th floor of St. Augustine's had effectively become Cross territory. Men in dark coats stood at every stairwell and elevator bank, checking identification, patting down visiting family members, glaring at anyone who lingered too long near the neonatal intensive care unit. At the center of it sat Damian himself, a man whose name alone could empty a courtroom of witnesses, reduced now to pacing outside a glass incubator like any other terrified father. He was 35 years old, built lean and dangerous under a charcoal Tom Ford suit, his Rolex Daytona catching the fluorescent light every time he checked the time obsessively, as though time itself might explain what was happening to his son. His eyes were a flat, dark brown that people in his world had learned to read like weather warnings. Quiet eyes meant calm. Quiet eyes that didn't blink meant somebody was about to disappear. His son, Gabriel, had been born at 31 weeks and had clawed his way to nearly 5 pounds. Within the first 10 days, a small miracle the doctors had been cautiously proud of. Then, 8 days ago, the weight gain reversed itself. Gabriel began losing ounces instead of gaining them, no matter how much specialized formula and intravenous nutrition the staff poured into his tiny body. "Explain it to me again," Damian said, his voice low and even, which was somehow worse than shouting. Dr. Howard Bellamy, the hospital's chief of neonatology, adjusted his glasses with a visibly trembling hand. He had treated senators' children and the offspring of Wall Street royalty, and none of it had prepared him for the particular terror of failing a man like Damian Cross. "Premature infants sometimes develop feeding intolerance," Bellamy said carefully. "We're seeing signs consistent with a metabolic disorder, possibly an inherited enzyme deficiency. We've adjusted his formula 3 times. We're running additional genetic panels. He weighed 4 pounds 11 ounces 5 days ago." Damian stepped close enough to the incubator that his breath fogged the glass. "Today he is 4 pounds 2 ounces. He is disappearing in front of me, doctor, in a building that charges me $11,000 a night, and you are telling me you don't know why. We are doing everything within the bounds of modern medicine, Mr. Cross." "Then bend the bounds." Damian's hand closed around the lapel of Bellamy's white coat, and the 2 armed men by the door shifted their weight, hands drifting toward their jackets out of pure habit. "If my son dies in this hospital, doctor, you will not outlive him by long." From across the unit, a nurse in pale green scrubs watched the confrontation with an expression that held more irritation than fear. Naomi Reyes was 29 years old, 5 years into NICU nursing, with sharp hazel eyes that missed almost nothing and a low tolerance for theatrics, even the kind delivered by men who could have her killed for the inconvenience. She had grown up in foster care in the Bronx, spent 2 years boxing competitively in her early 20s, before nursing school, redirected all that controlled aggression into something more useful, and she had learned a long time ago that fear, given an inch, always took the rest of the room. She set down the stack of fresh linens she was carrying and crossed the floor without hurrying. "Mr. Cross," her voice cut cleanly through the tension. "Let go of the doctor. You're raising the stress level in this room, and Gabriel's monitors are picking it up." Damian turned his dark eyes on her, and for a moment the entire unit seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion everyone assumed was coming. Instead, his gaze flicked to the monitor above the incubator, watched the baby's heart rate ticking upward in real time, and he released Bellamy's coat without another word. The doctor staggered back, smoothing his lapels with shaking hands, muttering something about reviewing the latest labs before fleeing toward his office. Damian dragged a hand down his face, and for the first time, the predator in him receded enough to show the exhausted man underneath. "He's slipping away from me," he said quietly, using her first name without quite meaning to, because someone had mentioned it to him days ago, and it had stuck. "Naomi?" She softened, just slightly, and stepped up beside him at the incubator. Reaching through the small porthole, she rested a gloved finger against Gabriel's tiny palm. His fingers curled instinctively around it, a reflex too small and too perfect not to break something in both of them a little. "I know how frightening this looks," she said, "but he's still fighting. Premature babies surprise us all the time. Why is he losing weight, Naomi? Tell me the truth. Is Bellamy right?" She hesitated. For the past 2 days, she had been quietly reviewing Gabriel's charts on her own time, an itch she couldn't ignore scratching at the back of her mind. Infants with genuine metabolic or enzyme disorders almost always showed accompanying signs: abnormal liver values, visible bloating, specific patterns in their blood gases. Gabriel had none of that. He simply burned through calories at a rate that made no biological sense, as though his body were running a furnace nobody had lit on purpose. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but something about this isn't adding up the way a normal feeding disorder should. Give me some time. I'm not going to let anything happen to him on my watch." That night, long after Damian had finally collapsed into uneasy sleep on the leather sofa in the family waiting room, Naomi sat at the nurse's station, cross-referencing Gabriel's cancer lab values against the exact timing of his feeds. She pulled up the digital charting system and began plotting his weight checks hour by hour, rather than day by day, something nobody on the day staff had bothered to do. A pattern emerged that made the hair on her arms stand up. Gabriel's weight held steady, almost stubbornly so, through the afternoon and evening, but every night, in the hours following the overnight specialized feed prepared by the hospital pharmacy, his weight dropped sharply by morning, far more than digestion alone could explain. It wasn't malabsorption. Something was actively forcing his small body to burn through calories at a dangerous, accelerated rate, and it was happening on a schedule that lined up exactly with one specific nightly feed. She thought immediately of every overworked nurse's nightmare, that someone inside the hospital itself was doing this on purpose, and just as quickly forced the thought down, because the alternative was almost too terrifying to consider seriously. The wing was crawling with Damian's armed men. A physical attack on the baby was impossible, but poison didn't need muscle or guns to get past anyone. She needed proof before she said a single word to Damian Cross, because an accusation against Malone, the chief of neonatology with no evidence behind it, would get someone killed, possibly her. At a little after 3 in the morning, with the ward quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors, Naomi let herself into the secure medication refrigeration room using her badge. The air inside was bitterly cold. She found Gabriel's labeled shelf and lifted one of the 2 prepared overnight feeding bags, holding it up to the light. It looked entirely ordinary. The barcode matched. The seal looked intact. She ran her thumb slowly along the plastic seam anyway, the way she'd been trained to check for tampering on controlled substances years ago, and felt it. A nearly invisible puncture mark near the base of the bag, sealed over with a dot of clear medical adhesive almost too small to notice unless you were looking for it specifically. Someone had injected something into the bag after it left the pharmacy. She drew a small sample into a sterile syringe with hands that had gone very steady the way they always did right before something important, slipped the vial into her scrub pocket, and stepped quietly out of the cold room, directly into the broad chest of Damian Cross. She gasped, stumbling back. He stood in the dim hallway in shirt sleeves, his tie gone, his expression unreadable in the low light. A stark contrast to the broken father she had comforted hours earlier. "What are you doing in the medication fridge at 3 a.m, Naomi?" His voice had gone velvet over steel, the way it probably had right before men, much more dangerous than her, stopped existing. "Checking inventory," she said, for his morning feed. He stepped closer, close enough that she caught the faint warmth of expensive cologne and dark coffee. "You're a terrible liar. Your pulse is visible in your throat right now." His gaze dropped briefly to her scrub pocket before returning to her face. "You found something." She weighed her options in the space of a single breath. "Tell him now," and he would tear the hospital apart with his bare hands before she had any real proof. Possibly, destroying the evidence in the process, and getting innocent staff killed along the way. Say nothing, and she risked him discovering it on his own, in a far worse way. "I have a theory," she said carefully. "But if I'm right, you cannot fly off the handle, Damian. You cannot make a scene. Whoever is doing this will cover their tracks the second they realize they've been caught, and then we will never get proof of anything." Something flickered behind his eyes, dark and dangerous. "Someone is doing this to him on purpose. I don't know who yet," she lied smoothly. "I need to run a test. Give me until morning. Can you do that?" He stared at her for a long, heavy moment, then reached up and brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the touch startlingly gentle for a man with his reputation, sending an unwelcome warmth straight down her spine. "If you save my son," he said quietly, "there is nothing in this world I will not give you." She swallowed hard and nodded, then hurried toward the service elevator before either of them could say anything else. The hospital's basement pathology lab sat empty at that hour. Naomi fed her sample into the mass spectrometer, using skills she hadn't touched since her pharmacology rotation in nursing school, and waited, pacing, checking the clock every few minutes. When the printout finally emerged, she stared at it until the words stopped swimming. A synthetic thyroid hormone analog, present in a concentration roughly 40 times higher than anything therapeutically appropriate for an adult, let alone a 5-pound infant. In microdoses delivered overnight, it would send a baby's metabolism into dangerous overdrive, burning fat and protein stores at a lethal, unstoppable rate, while mimicking the exact symptoms of a failure to thrive. It would not show up on standard newborn screening panels. It would look, to any ordinary doctor, exactly like a tragic and unexplained metabolic mystery. It was murder, administered 1 milliliter at a time, by someone with real access to pharmaceutical-grade compounds. She bolted from the lab, intending to swap the tampered bags for clean stock from an untouched patient's, paused on the 5th-floor stairwell, landing when she heard low voices drifting down from above. "This is taking too long. The captains are getting restless." She recognized the voice instantly. Marcus Cross, Damian's younger brother, had been a near-constant presence at the hospital since the night of the gas leak, offering grim, supportive company at every turn, the kind of brother who never left his sibling's side during a crisis. "I'm moving as carefully as the situation allows," came a second voice, clipped and irritated. "Dr. Bellamy." Naomi's blood went cold. "Move faster," Marcus snapped quietly. Sophia was supposed to die, with that baby still inside her. Instead, we have this drawn-out tragedy. Damian's a wreck. The board of capos is starting to wonder if he's even fit to run things anymore. If the boy dies, Damian breaks completely. He steps back, I step in, and your hospital gets that $3 million research grant we discussed. The compound is working exactly as intended, Bellamy whispered. His organs won't tolerate another 72 hours of this. Just keep Damian distracted and out of the lab reports. Naomi pressed a hand over her own mouth to keep from making a sound. This wasn't medical negligence. It was an assassination, executed slowly enough to look like grief and bad luck. By Damian's own blood. She waited until the stairwell door above closed, then climbed the remaining flights just in time to see Bellamy walking toward the medication refrigeration room, clearly intending to refresh the tampered supply before anyone noticed the missing sample. She needed to reach the evidence before he destroyed it. Slipping into the adjacent supply closet to grab a lockbox, she knocked a metal basin off a shelf in her haste, and it clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire ward. The closet door swung open a moment later, Bellamy stepped inside and locked it behind him, his eyes moving from Naomi's face down to the toxicology printout clutched in her hand. A thin, cold smile spread across his face. "You always were too sharp for this job, Nurse Reyes." He drew a pre-filled syringe from his coat pocket, the needle catching the harsh closet light. "It's a terrible shame about the sudden cardiac event you're about to have." He expected her to scream, to beg, to freeze the way frightened people always froze in his experience. What Howard Bellamy did not know was that the woman in front of him had spent 2 years sparring, 3 times a week at a gym in the South Bronx, that didn't believe in soft warm-ups, long before nursing school had ever entered her plans, and that years of working NICU codes had trained her body to move calmly and decisively the instant adrenaline hit, instead of locking up the way most people's did. As he lunged with the needle aimed at her throat, Naomi pivoted sharply rather than retreating, stepping directly into his guard and driving a hard palm strike up into his forearm. The syringe spun out of his grip and skittered harmlessly across the linoleum. Before he could recover, she swept his front leg out from under him, dropping him hard onto his back, the air leaving his lungs in a wheeze. She had her knee pressed against his throat a heartbeat later, just enough pressure to make his eyes bulge with genuine fear. "You took an oath to protect patients," she said, her voice flat and cold in a way that had nothing left of the gentle nurse Damian had spoken to in the hallway. "And then you tried to murder an infant on my shift." The closet door burst open behind her, nearly off its hinges. 2 of Damian's men swept the small room with drawn pistols before Damian himself stepped court through the doorway. He took in the scene in a single sweeping glance, the syringe on the floor, the gasping doctor pinned beneath his son's nurse, and the lab printout still clutched in Naomi's free hand. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Naomi," Damian said, his voice gone unnervingly quiet. "Get up." She rose slowly, never taking her eyes off Bellamy as the guards hauled him up by his collar and pinned him against the wire shelving. "He's been poisoning Gabriel," she said, handing Damian the printout. "A synthetic thyroid compound, slipped into his overnight feed. It forces his metabolism into overdrive, burns through every calorie he gets before his body can use it." "It wasn't malabsorption, Damian. It was never an accident." He stared at the paper, his jaw tightening until the muscle there stood out sharply. Then he stepped toward Bellamy and drew a Sig Sauer P226 from beneath his jacket, pressing the barrel flat against the doctor's forehead. "Please," Bellamy sobbed. "Please, Mr. Cross, it wasn't my idea. He threatened to destroy everything I've built." "Who?" Damian said. The single syllable carried the weight of an execution. Naomi stepped forward and laid her hand gently over his gun hand. The guards flinched, clearly startled that anyone would dare touch their boss mid-rage. But Damian didn't pull away. "It was your brother," she said quietly. "I heard him on the stairwell with Bellamy not 20 minutes ago. Marcus is paying for all of this. He wants Gabriel dead so you break completely, so the capos lose faith in you and he can step into your place." Damian's eyes widened a fraction, the betrayal landing like a physical blow. Marcus was his own blood, the only family he had left after losing Sophia. "If you put a bullet in this man right now," Naomi said carefully, "Marcus will hear about it within the hour and disappear, or destroy every piece of evidence connecting him to this. A boss who executes people on suspicion alone loses the room. We need him to confess in front of the people who matter." Damian looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, recalculating everything he thought he understood about the quiet nurse who had been keeping his son alive. He lowered the gun slowly. "Here is what happens now, Howard," he said, his voice dropping into something far colder than rage. "You're going to walk back into that NICU and replace every tampered bag with clean nutrition. Tonight, my son eats real food for the first time in a week, and tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock exactly, you're going to call a code blue and tell my brother that Gabriel didn't make it." Bellamy nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. "And if you so much as breathe a warning to Marcus," Damian added, "I will find every person you've ever loved, and I will make you watch." That night, Naomi mixed Gabriel's feeds herself, refusing to trust the pharmacy with anything until the threat was fully dealt with. Damian stayed at her side for most of it, watching her work with a kind of quiet, focused attention that made her uncomfortable in ways she didn't have time to examine. Near 2 in the morning, with Gabriel finally stable and sleeping soundly for the first time in days, Damian poured 2 glasses of Macallan 25 from a bottle one of his men had brought up from the penthouse, sliding one across the small table toward her. "You don't have to drink it," he said, "but I think we've both earned it." She took a small, grounding sip, feeling the warmth settle through her chest. "Why does this feel personal to you?" she asked. "I mean beyond the obvious. You watch me like I'm something you're afraid of losing too." He turned his glass slowly in his hand before answering. "Because in 3 weeks, you've fought harder for my son than anyone in this building, including me. I don't know how to thank someone for that. I'm not sure men like me are built for gratitude that doesn't come with strings attached." The space between them had closed, without either of them quite deciding to let it. His hand found hers on the table, his thumb tracing slowly along her knuckles, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the air between them charged with something neither was ready to name. A phone buzzed violently against the table, shattering the stillness. Damian answered it, and his expression hardened within seconds. One of his men, stationed outside Marcus's apartment as a precaution, had just watched 2 unfamiliar vehicles bearing plates registered to the Drago family, the Crosses' bitter rivals on the east side, pull into the building's private garage. "I have to deal with this," Damian said, already rising, the moment between them dissolving instantly. "Stay close to him tonight. Don't let anyone near that incubator who isn't on the approved list." He left her standing alone with the soft beeping of the monitors, the unfinished moment between them, aching in a way she didn't have a name for yet. 2 nights later, with most of Damian's attention pulled toward managing the fallout of the Drago family's sudden and aggressive interest in his territory, he asked his head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Felix Trent, who had served the Cross organization loyally for nearly 8 years, to stay behind at the hospital and watch over Naomi and the baby while Damian personally handled a tense meeting downtown. What Damian did not know was that Felix had spent the last several weeks in quiet negotiations of his own with the Drago family, offered a sum large enough to disappear permanently in exchange for one very specific task: deliver Naomi Reyes to them the moment Damian left the hospital, since she alone could connect Marcus to the attempted murder of the heir and had become, in the Drago's calculation, the single greatest threat to destabilizing the Cross organization from the inside. While Damian's convoy crossed the bridge into Queens, Felix made his move, finding Naomi alone in the family waiting room, reviewing Gabriel's overnight chart. "Time to go," Felix said, drawing a pistol from beneath his jacket with the same casual confidence he used ordering coffee. Naomi's pulse spiked, but her hands stayed remarkably steady at her sides. "I don't understand," she said, her voice deliberately small and frightened, the voice of a terrified civilian who had clearly never been in a situation like this in her life. "Please, I just work here." "Relax," Felix said, gesturing toward the service exit with the gun. "You're not the target, you're leverage. The Dragos want Cross destabilized, and nothing destabilizes a man faster than losing the one person keeping his son alive. Walk." He stepped closer, reaching for her arm, with the loose, overconfident grip of a man who had clearly never been told that the woman in front of him had spent years training her body to respond to exactly this kind of mistake. He saw a pregnant patient's nurse, soft-spoken and easily controlled. He had no idea he was looking at someone who had broken an opponent's jaw in a sanctioned amateur match 3 years before nursing school had ever crossed her mind, or that years of restraining combative, panicked parents during pediatric emergencies had sharpened those old reflexes into something far more dangerous than they had ever been in the common ring. The moment his fingers closed around her wrist, Naomi twisted into him rather than away, driving the heel of her free hand up into his nose with a sharp, controlled snap. Cartilage gave way under the impact, blood pouring instantly. Felix staggered, the gun wavering, and she didn't give him a second to recover, striking his closed wrist hard enough to send the weapon clattering across the floor before sweeping his leg out and dropping him flat onto the linoleum, the air slamming out of his lungs. She dropped to one knee beside him, scooped up the fallen pistol with a grip that was perfectly steady, and pressed it lightly beneath his chin. "Who sent you?" she said. Her voice had changed completely. Gone was the small, frightened nurse. What replaced it was flat and absolutely certain. The Dragos, Felix gasped, blood running freely down his lips. Please, I wasn't going to hurt you, I swear. It was just, you were going to hand me to men who would have used me to bury an infant and his father in the same week, Naomi said. I think we both know exactly what that means. She wasn't a frightened civilian who happened to be standing too close to a dangerous world. She was a fighter whose body remembered every hour of training her conscious mind had buried, under years of clinical routine, a weapon hiding in plain sight inside hospital scrubs. Damian arrived back at the hospital 11 minutes later, alerted by the silent alarm built into the family suite, his Glock 19 already drawn as he took the stairs 2 at a time, bracing for the worst. What he found instead stopped him dead in the doorway. Felix Trent lay zip-tied to a chair leg, his face a ruin of dried blood, staring up with an expression of total disbelief. Naomi stood near the window, the pistol resting loosely in her hand, her posture calm and unshaken, utterly unrecognizable from the quietly competent nurse who had spent 3 weeks at his son's bedside. He works for the Dragos, she said simply, without looking up. He was going to hand me over to them. Damian's eyes moved slowly from Felix's battered face to the gun in her hand, to the steady, controlled way she stood, and something in his chest cracked open, not with confusion or anger, but with something close to awe. He had spent 3 weeks watching a woman he believed was simply gentle, careful, and tireless. He realized now, standing in that doorway, that he had never come close to understanding the full truth of who she actually was. How did you, he started, and couldn't finish the sentence. I used to box, she said simply, finally meeting his eyes. A long time ago. I didn't think any of it would still be in there. Damian crossed the room and knelt beside Felix, gripping his collar. You're going to tell me everything you told her, and more, he said quietly. And you should be thanking whatever God you believe in that she got to you first. Because I would not have stopped. He handed Felix over to his remaining detail and turned his full attention back to Naomi, who stood watching him with a strange, searching expression, as though waiting to see what he would do with the truth of her, now that he finally had it. The next morning, Marcus Cross arrived at the hospital exactly on schedule, summoned by a tearful phone call from Dr. Bellamy, delivering the news that baby Gabriel had not survived the night. He found his brother shattered in the family waiting room, glass from a broken side table scattered across the floor, Damian's face buried in his hands, in an image of total, public collapse. Damian, Marcus murmured, pulling his older brother into an embrace that looked, to the assembled capos summoned to pay their respects, exactly like grief. I am so sorry. This family has lost too much. He's gone, Marcus, Damian said, his voice cracking with terrible precision. I have nothing left to lead with. Marcus straightened, turning toward the 6 captains gathered uncomfortably in the sterile hallway, his expression arranging itself into something appropriately solemn, while something else entirely gleamed underneath. Gentlemen, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly, this is a dark day for our family. With Sophia gone, and now the boy, it's clear Damian cannot lead in this state. The Dragos are pressing our western routes. Our shipments out of the port have already slipped twice this month. We need someone with a clear head. As underboss, it's my duty to step forward. Effective today, I am assuming control. The captains exchanged uneasy glances, several beginning to nod, because in their world, grief that paralyzed a leader was simply another kind of weakness. Is that right, Marcus? Damian's voice cut through the room, no longer broken, no longer grieving. He stood slowly, straightening his jacket, his posture radiating an authority that made every man in the hallway go still. He gestured toward the doorway. Naomi Reyes stepped through it, cradling a small, breathing, visibly alive infant wrapped in a soft blue blanket, his color already pink and healthy after a full day of proper, untainted nutrition. Marcus's face drained of all color. What is this? He managed. Bellamy said. Bellamy said exactly what I told him to say, Damian said calmly. 2 of his men dragged Bellamy into the hallway by his arms and dropped him onto the floor at Marcus's feet. Damian pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket and pressed play, and the doctor's own terrified voice filled the corridor, detailing every piece of the conspiracy, the thyroid compound, The $3 million promised through a research grant. The careful timing designed to break Damian's mind 1 ounce at a time. The captain's expressions shifted from confusion to cold, murderous understanding. "You set me up," Marcus hissed, reaching for the weapon inside his jacket. Before his fingers closed around the grip, 4 separate captains had already drawn theirs, leveling them at his head. He froze, completely surrounded by men who had followed him into the hallway as allies and now stood ready to execute him as a traitor. "You came after a mother and a newborn child," Damian said quietly, stepping until he stood inches from his brother's face. "You are not family anymore, Marcus. You are nothing." He turned to his most trusted captain. "Take him to the warehouse on Atlantic Avenue. Make sure he understands exactly what he cost this family before he stops breathing." Marcus screamed something about blood and loyalty as the men dragged him toward the service elevator. His protest cut short the moment the heavy doors closed. Damian turned to Bellamy, still weeping on the floor. "As for you, the medical board will never hear about this. A federal judge, who owes me several favors, will. You're going to plead guilty to fraud and unlawful drug distribution, and we're going to spend the next 2 decades somewhere my reach is considerably longer than yours." When the hallway finally emptied, only Damian, Naomi, and the sleeping baby remained. He crossed to her slowly, the ruthless mask falling away entirely, leaving only an exhausted, grateful father standing in front of the woman who had saved everything he had left. "You saved my world," he said quietly. "I was just doing my job," she said, smiling faintly. "Someone had to look out for him. You did far more than that. You stood down a killer, and then you stood down me. More than once." He reached up and gently cupped her face, his thumb tracing along her jaw. "I owe you a debt I don't know how to repay." "You could start," she said, her heart climbing into her throat as he leaned closer. "By letting me keep doing my job. Except maybe somewhere you can't fire me the next time I tell you to put the gun down." He laughed, a low, genuine sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and closed the last of the distance between them, his mouth finding hers gently at first, and then with a quiet, certain intensity that felt less like an ending and more like the start of something neither of them had been looking for. 3 months later, the Gabriel Cross Pediatric Wing opened on the 9th floor of St. Augustine's, fully funded by Damian and placed under the direction of its newly appointed head of neonatal nursing, Naomi Reyes. Gabriel himself had grown into a loud, healthy, stubborn infant, thriving in his father's arms, and watched over fiercely by the woman who had once knelt in a supply closet and refused to be anyone's easy target. He had once believed his empire could buy anything he needed to keep his son alive. In the end, it had taken one nurse with sharp hazel eyes, a quiet voice, and a past nobody bothered to ask about, to do what all his money and all his men could not. This story carries a simple truth worth sitting with. The people we underestimate are often the only ones paying close enough attention to save us. Was Naomi right to fight Damian's battles for him before telling him the full truth? Or should she have brought him in from the very first night? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If this story kept you watching until the very end, hit that like button and tell us which scene hit you the hardest. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because new stories like this one are coming every single week, and you will not want to miss what happens next.